We are going to finish up talking about speech perception today. I plan to finish talking about speech perception. I am going to split it up into two lectures, into two shows here. I'm not sure that I'm going to plan to get to touch today. I did have one question, and I'll check my email before I put everything online to make sure I don't have more questions about the review that went online on Monday. So this is just context of what we discussed last time, so that we have this lack of invariance. There is a great deal of variability in the speech stream, in the acoustic signal, and in these phonemes. They are changing their quality due to the context, due to co-articulation, the fact that we are creating, all of these phonemes are influenced by the ones that come before and the ones that come after them, as we are co-articulating. We're creating them partly at the same time. And yet we have this perceptual constancy. Phonemes sound like phonemes. I'm going to talk just a little bit more about the variability of the speech stream, and then we'll see how we are succeeding at having perceptual constancy. Okay, so there's not just variability in the speech stream because of context and co-articulation. We also have a great deal of variability from different speakers and even within speakers. So within speakers, I can be really happy when I say a sentence, or I can be really unhappy when I say a sentence. And those sentences were pretty similar with really different emotion. And we might even have some tears in there or whatever, where it's getting a little bit broken up. And with that emotion, we are still perceiving the phonemes as the phonemes in the speech stream mostly correctly. Fatigue, when we get tired, we might tend to mumble a little bit and slur a little bit. As long as that's not a great deal of mumbling and slurring, people still understand us. We can even talk with gum in our mouths and people understand us just fine. I usually give the example here of when I used to brush my teeth, and I was deciding with my nephew and niece which show we were going to watch next or what game we were going to watch next. And they couldn't understand everything I said with a toothbrush in my mouth, but they did a pretty good job of understanding me, even with a toothbrush in my mouth. We have even more variability between speakers. If we look at different people with different dialects, we all sound really different from each other, and yet we tend to understand each other. If you've moved around or gone to different places or listened to different speakers quite a bit, you might see that there are some words, there are some structures that it takes you a little while maybe to interpret or a little while to get used to, but we understand people with wildly different dialects. As we talked about allophones in the last lecture, these allophones change a great deal. And I mentioned British speakers having the bottle, and I think I did, and butter, that they have that glottal stop in the middle of where we have a flap with bottle and butter. They have a glottal stop, but we understand them, they understand us. We also speak at different rates. Some people speak relatively slowly, and some people talk much more quickly, and we tend to keep up with the different rates and understand people who are talking more slowly as well. And we have people speaking from different genders, and so slightly different frequencies, and yet we understand people from different genders as well, just seamlessly. It just doesn't seem any different to listen to a man as listening to a woman, as far as how much we understand of what they're saying, right? So we have a limited number of categories. We have a limited number of phonemes, categories of sound, these phonemes that are formed from a really wide range of acoustic signals that vary based on within speakers, between speakers, and because of context and co-articulation. With these categories, we have phonemes have clear phonetic boundaries. This is called categorical perception, and I'm going to show an example on the next slide. Okay, so for an example of categorical perception, I'm going to use this study from Imus and Corbett, 1973, that was looking at voice onset time. So if we go back and remember, when you say da, that D, right, is a voiced alveolar stop. It's voiced, and the voicing is starting at about 17 milliseconds. When you say ta, ta, that T is a voiceless alveolar stop, and the voicing doesn't start until about 91 milliseconds as we start to get into the ah sound. So if we look at what people are perceiving, Imus and Corbett gave participants a computerized voice onset time for these sounds where they controlled and manipulated voice onset time to be at 0 milliseconds, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60, 65, 70, 75, 80. Okay, so all of those different timings of different times in milliseconds that the voicing starts. And again, this was controlled by computer. And what they found was if there was, I'm going to use this 25 millisecond change, if there was a 25 millisecond change within a category boundary, so if we look at DA, if they went from 0 milliseconds to 25 milliseconds, that is still all perceived as DA. And with that 25 millisecond difference, people said, these sound the same to me. Okay, and as we move out past 50 milliseconds to 50 milliseconds to 75 milliseconds, we see the same thing. Now we're in the category of ta, and even with a 25 millisecond difference, those sound the same to people. Now let's look at the 25 milliseconds that spans that categorical boundary between da and ta for us, as this phonemic difference, the difference between da and ta, is a meaningful difference in our language, but it has this particular boundary in it, so that if they looked at 25 milliseconds, let's say starting at 30 milliseconds, going to 55 milliseconds, this looks like it must be 25 milliseconds to 50 milliseconds, that 25 milliseconds, now they're saying those sound different. Okay, so again, a categorical boundary where if it's on one side of the boundary, it sounds like that phoneme. If it's on the other side of the boundary, it sounds like the other phoneme. And if it spans the boundary, it sounds different to us. And this is particularly for English. We have another language, so in Spanish, they have a different ta sound. If I remember, that boundary is different. If you want to talk to any Spanish speakers about how much we understand or don't understand when we hear or don't perceive those differences. When we are working to understand speech, we are a great deal using the context to understand speech. I'm going to show that in just a minute. Another thing, we do everything we can to understand this very complicated speech stream. And one of the things we see is an effect of visual information on speech perception. I actually started introducing this back when we were talking about music and sound and how vision and sound and hearing interact. But this great example of audio-visual speech perception, as it is called, is the McGurk effect. And a lot of you, I know, have experience with the McGurk effect because I usually have students who are pretty excited when we start talking about it, and they can tell me about it already. I give you the link in Blackboard for this video where the person is saying ba, ba, ba. Okay. You should go ahead and click on that link. Pause this here and click on that link because it's much funner to watch it than to have me yammer on about it. But anyway, so he's going ba, ba, ba. And then you start to see his lips and they change to say fa, fa, fa. And you can see his teeth come to his lower lip. And he's actually, the auditory, the sound clip, he is still saying ba, 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 but we start to hear him say fa, fa, fa. So in this case, the visual information trumps the auditory information. Even though this is auditory speech stream, if we're looking at his lips, we are hearing what we are seeing instead of what the sound clip is actually playing. And you can prove it to yourself by closing your eyes as he's saying the fa, fa, fa with his lips. And when you close your eyes, you hear ba, 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 and you can open your eyes and it can go back and forth. And no matter how, even if you know that this is an illusion, you cannot not hear the illusion. So since we know that there is this audiovisual nature to speech perception and that we use visual information, we look at a speaker's face, especially if you've noticed, I know that my hearing is not that well, and especially if there's background noise, and you may have already noticed in class, if you ask a question and I'll tend to try to look at you, and I try to get as much information as I possibly can from a speaker's face. In this study by Kriegstein et al., 2005, they had participants listen to speech of familiar and unfamiliar speakers. And in both cases, the superior temporal sulcus was activated with speech perception. Oftentimes, we've talked about the perception of movement already when we've gotten to this chapter, but since I've switched things around, we have not. So let's talk about the superior temporal sulcus for a second. The superior temporal sulcus helps us to understand biological motion. It's involved with a lot of aspects of understanding other people and understanding biological motion. So I sometimes show these kind of point light walkers that we are activating the superior temporal sulcus. Every time you pass someone in the street and you look them in the eyes, you're activating the superior temporal sulcus. We look to people's mouths and their eyes and everything to understand what are they saying, what are they talking about, and so forth. And so just listening to speech activates the superior temporal sulcus, this area that's involved with biological motion. And that was for familiar or unfamiliar speakers. If we look at the fusiform face area, this area is activated when we're listening to a familiar speaker, but not when we're listening to an unfamiliar speaker. So we have talked about the fusiform face area, this area that is active when we see particular faces. So if we have some kind of image in mind for a particular speaker, that fusiform face area is active as we're kind of trying to imagine them saying it to some extent. Whereas if it's an unfamiliar speaker, there's no activation of this kind of image of a person. Even though it doesn't feel like, if you're listening to me right now, it probably doesn't feel like, oh, I'm imagining her face saying these things. But your fusiform face area is active. Another thing that helps us perceive the speech stream very much is the role of context. And I mentioned this before, but I'm going to come back to, so we're using all the information that we can to understand this very complicated speech stream. We're using visual information where we can. We're using context whenever it's available. The person who's looked into this that I know the most is Richard Warren. In 1970, came up with this really neat study, the phonemic restoration effect. And if you remember me mentioning when we were talking about segregating the auditory stream and talking about auditory continuity, that was Richard Warren as well. And he had this broadband sound that played over a tone, where the tone actually, it was the tone would go away, the broadband cough or sound would come on, and then the tone, and then the sound, cough, or broadband noise, and then the tone again. And it sounds as if the tone is playing behind that noise, even though it's silence behind the noise. He did a very similar study with speech. And if you're going to go, I really strongly recommend that you go and click on this link. There used to be a different one where when you get to the website, there were only a couple of links to figure out and to work through. But this one, you'll want to click on the top link and work your way down and read what's between them just a little bit to put this all together of what Richard Warren's doing. And I'm going to try and do this as much as I can with the state legislatures, blah, 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 blah. I can't remember the rest, but the state legislatures is enough. It was in the middle of a sentence. And the legislatures, that sound was missing completely. Okay, they took it out and there was a silence, except that letter sound at that point was replaced with a cough, which sometimes I'm calling a broadband noise, so that's just using lots of different frequencies. But they started out with this kind of just the state legislatures, I can't do it, but this letter was replaced with a cough the letter is missing. People hear the missing letter. It sounds as if it's in there, and they cannot correctly place the cough. And in fact, Richard Warren went around to his colleagues and people around his school and played this for them, even though they knew where the letter or where the sound was missing. They still I can't exactly place what's missing. I can't tell what's missing, and it sounds like it just sounds like it is there. But again, it's going to be a lot better if you go in and click through those links and you listen to the example. And this is showing the role of context, that we can even have missing data and we fill that in. And even more fun and kind of interesting is this: there was time to Ave, okay, where the asterisk is the cough sound or a broadband noise with lots of frequencies. I can't remember which all the time, but at this point, if you'll notice, there was time to Ave. This is ambiguous, and that word could be save, shave, wave, rave, and so on, right? So that is an ambiguous word. Participants heard the word wave when the remainder of the sentence had to do with saying goodbye to a departing friend. So there was time to Ave as the steamboat took off or whatever. So in this case, we are filling in the sound after the sound is actually not there. So at this point, it's ambiguous. The sound is not there. It's a cough or some broadband sound. We listen to the rest of the sentence that disambiguates, and we go back in time, and we still restore that phoneme, which to me is just incredible. Really, really neat. A study that's really different, a really different study for looking at how we use sentence context to understand what we are hearing. Miller and Isard in 1963 found that words are more intelligible when heard in grammatical sentences that make sense. Okay, so these are just some examples of their sentences, and you can see from the anomalous and the ungrammatical string that they were using the same words and counterbalancing and doing all that nice stuff. So a normal grammatical sentence example would be: gadgets simplify work around the house. An anomalous but grammatical sentence, so a sentence that is semantically anomalous and does not make sense but is grammatical, is gadgets kill passengers from the eyes. And then an ungrammatical string would look like: between gadgets, highways, passengers, the steal. And if you're going to learn about me that I really enjoy talking gibberish, and that's always a really fun sentence for me to say every semester: between gadgets, highways, passengers, the steal. So this was a shadowing study, and if you remember, we saw shadowing, an example of shadowing, earlier this semester when Mike came up, and I think he gave up, and listened to one person say something in one ear, and he was shadowing the other person, attempting to just say everything that the other person was saying while listening to someone else, in that kind of dichotic listening task. Miller and Isard start off with a simple shadowing study. They're simply listening to those sentences and shadowing them, saying them out loud. With a normal grammatical sentence, they're at 89% accuracy. They're pretty good. When it's anomalous, it semantically does not make sense, but it is grammatical. They're at 79% accuracy. And when we get down to the ungrammatical string, they've lost it. They're down at 56% accuracy now. They're really not doing very well. What's even more telling is when they had participants shadow with a high level of background noise. So there's this sound kind of going on, and they're trying to hear the sentences, and they're still doing that, just repeating exactly what the sentences say. For normal grammatical sentences, this brings the accuracy down to 63%. For anomalous, semantically, sentences that do not make sense semantically but are grammatical, they're doing very poorly at 22%. And with the ungrammatical string, again, they're way down there, and now they're down at 3% accuracy. So you can see that even if things don't make sense semantically, grammar helps us to piece things together because 3% accuracy is terrible. Okay, so speech segmentation, how we perceive breaks between words. And you can see in this speech spectrogram being shown here, this is more idealized than some of what we saw with had in the earlier slideshow. But speech segmentation, there's not a real silence between the ch's, between speech segmentation, and there appears to be more silence at the p in speech segmentation. So it's a really nice example of the fact that we do not really have silence between words. And I am putting this back up there. This I was talking about it before as context and how do we understand our speech stream. But so if you tried to figure this out, some of you probably did. The sentence at the very top there under speech segmentation is, "The red on a tea kettle often chips." Don't know if you figured that out. It took me a really long time. I tend to go towards there. There donate a kettle of tin chips. And most students go through that. That doesn't make sense, but what I'm reading is there donate a kettle of tin chips. Again, when we are reading, these things are split apart. When we're speaking, they're not split apart, but there are other aspects of the speech stream that are giving us cues to what words are, and that is that we're saying the appropriate phonemes. So the red on a tea kettle often chips makes a lot more sense, right? And I'm going to go ahead and do the one underneath that. Anna Mary Candy lights since imp pulp lay things. If you try to say that really fast, I have a hard time because the imp pulp lay things is doesn't come out the way you would think. But this is obviously, I hope it's obvious that this is a speech stream, a sentence where the speech segmentation has been changed and messed up. What this sentence, if we say it really fast, again, it gets kind of jumbled at the end. This is saying, "An American delights in simple playthings." But again, where that segmentation occurs, we are getting that from the speech stream, even though this is pretty incredible. And I'm going to give you at least a couple of examples of just how very incredible this is, and then I'm going to tell you how we succeed at this. So in this example, we have a couple of clear ambiguities that are not ambiguous when we are writing, but that are ambiguous when we are speaking. And yet, as I'm going to say them to you, they're not going to feel ambiguous, right? We're using context a great deal. So Jamie's mother said, "Be a big girl and eat your vegetables." Versus, "The thing Big Earl loved the most in the world was his car." Well, big girl and Big Earl, I have a I can feel a slight difference when I say it, but I'm pretty sure if you measured the speech stream and looked at the speech stream, there is very little difference between Big Girl and Big Earl. And yet, we hear that without any problems. Again, we're really using the context of the sentence to help us figure out what the person is saying. And it doesn't feel like there's an ambiguity there. And as I suggested before, so this is really seamless and we don't even notice the problem when we're listening to our own language. Of course, I can tell where words begin and end when somebody's speaking, at least most people are speaking. Yeah, even with this co-articulation and the fact that it just all runs together. But listen to another language. This usually is one of my favorite parts because I do get a student to come up and say this in another language. Especially, there's usually a student who is at least somewhat fluent in another language. But because we're doing this online, well, I get to show off my French, but my French is not that good. And so I don't sound like a native speaker, but if you have been to a foreign country, you'll know, you'll remember, right, that it's really difficult. And I remember being in Germany and going to the Netherlands, and I can't remember exactly what I was listening for, but let's just say I was listening for the Bonnenstrasse, or a particular street. And I know that I'm listening for Bohnenstrasse, and that's all I'm listening for, but it's couched in this just like this gobbledygook where I can't tell the beginnings and ends of anything, and it's kind of frightening because you can't pick out the little bit of the speech stream that you truly need in that case. But so if you'll notice as I'm reading, again, I'm not even a native speaker, and so I'm going to have more pauses than a normal native speaker would, and they're going to be between words because of the nature of speech. But so I'm going to do this in French, and you can just listen to, can I tell where words begin and end? If you speak French, you might do okay with this. But j'ai un rêve qu'un jour cette nation se lèvera et vivra le vrai son de sa croyance. Nous tenons les vérités comme allant de soi, que tous les hommes sont créés égaux. Retournez au Mississippi, retournez en Alabama, retournez en Caroline du Sud, retournez en Géorgie, retournez en Louisiane. Okay, and I've picked out these two pieces of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, the I Have a Dream speech, which is one of my favorite speeches, because the beginning is obviously extremely difficult to pick out any words if you don't know the language. But as we get into the retourner au, Mississippi, Alabama, Caroline du Sud, Géorgie, and Louisiane, that you have some idea, right? Because you're looking at it for one, and you know those states, and there's a lot of overlap in the French and how they interpret our words for our states. So those are words that you know enough of that you can kind of, what it's called is bootstrapping, that you can kind of bootstrap into the figuring out, oh, retourner, oh, that must be go back, right? And it's repeating, retourner, retourner. And so as you're bootstrapping, now you have more words, right? You have retourner, and if I use that in a new sentence, it's going to help you to figure out where words begin and end. So how do we actually do this? Well, we are better at figuring all of this out when we are infants, when we are young and we are just learning language. We do have a sensitive period for language and a critical period for language where we stop hearing particular phonemes from. So we are born with the ability to hear any possible phoneme in any possible language. But as we're listening to language, as we're developing, we lose that ability. So if you notice with the Japanese, with the L, R, L, R distinction, that if we are playing those for Japanese infants at the age of 6 months, they can hear the difference between L and R, between the L and the R. But by 12 months old, they're no longer able to distinguish that difference, because that is not a phonemic difference in their language. That is not a meaningful difference in their language. So one of the people who've looked at this ability to perceive breaks between words, Jennifer Safran and her colleagues. So Jennifer Safran's done a lot of work with language acquisition, and she has examined infants' abilities to learn from transitional probabilities, as they are called, or this kind of statistical learning. And I think I talked about this with object recognition and the Bayesian theory, that it looks like we have a lot of statistical learning, a lot of implicit learning, where we are using the probabilities based on our experience with the world. So if we look at infants, these were 6-month-olds, I think, and they were hearing words like bidaku, padoti, golabu, tupiro, and they would hear this in a stream where they were just mushed together just like someone was speaking. So these are 4 non-words that were made up by the experimenters, and they would be repeated over and over again for 2 minutes straight. Bidaku, padoti, golabu, tupiro, padoti, bidaku, and it's hard for me to do, but so they created this so that they were randomly presented, so they would be following each other about a third of the time. So there are 4 of them. So if we look at statistically, what is the infant hearing? Well, da is going to follow B in bidaku 100% of the time. In the example that we have here, and what they gave those kids, they gave those infants, they are making sure that if you notice, that each of those syllables is in one of the 4 non-words. So da follows B 100% of the time. Ku follows da 100% of the time in bidaku. Now, if we look at other transitional probabilities, pa from padoti, it's going to follow the ku of bidaku 33% of the time. Go from golabu is going to follow ku 33% of the time, and tu from tupiro is going to follow ku from bidaku 33% of the time. Are we using these transitional probabilities? How can we use these? So Jennifer Safran and her colleagues, these were actually 8-month-old infants. They examined infants' looking time at whole words from the experiment versus partial words from the experiment. So whole words from the experiment where they are repeating that bidaku, padoti, golabu, tupiro again, versus partial words from the experiment where they were using those same syllables, but they were mix and matching them differently. So they were no longer the words from the experiment, but all of the syllables from the experiment were the same. And I'm going to explain this looking time measure. So what they would do is they would have the infant look at maybe a light or something, and as they were looking at the light, that would cause them to hear the string. The string would be played, the string of words or partial words or whatever, that string would be played as long as they look at the light, and when they look away from the light long enough, it stops playing. So this is giving some indication of their interest. And this looking time measure is pretty typical for how they measure infants' perceptual abilities, because infants habituate. And so if they are listening to these words over and over again for 2 minutes, they're probably not going to be that interested in continuing to listen to those words. They're not going to learn very long. Or they're not going to look very long at the light in order to listen to those words. But if the partial words were indeed new to them, they're going to look longer. And so if we look at the figure, that's exactly what we see in the whole word condition. When they are doing the experimental part of controlling how long they look at in order to hear those words, they do not look very long in comparison to the partial word condition where they're just repeating syllables. And so this is something new and something novel, and they can tell that. And they can tell that based on the transitional probabilities, and that they've heard this for 2 minutes. That's just 2 minutes, and they can already tell what's a word and what's a new word for them.